well today. Today is going to be kind of a different video and more of a sense that it's just going to be really informative. I asked a lot of you on Instagram last week if you wanted to send me some of your kind of science-y canning questions, and I have a whole page to get through, and I asked this question and asked for people to send questions in because I'm the kind of person that understands a process a lot better when I understand the why behind it. And so things like, why are certain foods water bath canned and why are certain foods pressure canned? Why do they need to be pressure canned? What does the pressure even mean? Those were the kind of questions that I went and researched for myself when I was learning how to can, and that knowledge helped me understand the process of canning a lot better, made things easier for me. So I wasn't just kind of blindly following directions. I knew why they came from. And so I think to start off the bat, we just need to talk about the difference between pressure canning and water bath canning. That would be probably the best place to start and kind of lay a foundation for the rest of the questions. So I have my two canners here. This one is a pressure canner. This one is a water bath canner. You can see the pressure canner has this gauge right here. This is what tells you the pounds of pressure that it has. It has a lid that locks into place. It comes with a little weight that goes on top, and then there's a rack inside. So you can always tell a pressure canner from a water bath canner because a pressure canner will always have a lid that locks into place. A water bath canner is not, because the water bath canner does not need to get to pressure. So your water bath canner, look, this is a very typical common water bath canner. It's just a big pot with a lid that comes off, and I also have a rack in mine as well. You can also get a steam canner, which I don't have because it serves the same purpose as a water bath canner. The same things that you would can in a water bath canner are the exact same foods you would use in a steam canner. And so you don't really need to have a steam canner and a water bath canner, so I just have a water bath canner. Now, the reason we have two different canners is because different foods require different temperatures to kill off the bacteria inside them to make them shelf stable. So if you think of every single can of food as an environment, you have some environments that are more acidic, like salsa, like canned peaches, like vinegar pickles, and then you have some environments that are not acidic, like stew meat, like green beans and carrots and chicken and meats and vegetables in general. Those are not acidic foods. They don't create an acidic enough environment in the jars to be able to ward off bacteria that could harm us. And so when you're canning something like pickles and vinegar, that environment is acidic enough that certain kinds of bacteria won't survive in it at all. And so you only need to heat it up to boiling to be able to kill off that other bacteria that might be harmful for us. And so this is why we have the water bath canner for acidic foods, is they would go in here because they only need to get to a certain kind of temperature. Once you start ranging into like meats and vegetables and stuff like that, you have to pressure can them because they have to get above boiling to kill off those other harmful bacteria and make it shelf stable. So the pounds of pressure is not about putting pressure on the jars, it's about heating it up. I had to go get a sleepy baby. So while this pot heats up, it will only ever get to 112 degrees Fahrenheit, which is boiling. It will never get hotter than that because all of the steam escapes once the water boils and turns to steam. This pressure canner catches that steam, and that's why it seals. And so this can get hotter than that, and the way you tell how hot it is based off the pounds of pressure. So when it gets to 10 pounds of pressure, it's at 240 degrees. When it gets to 15 pounds of pressure, it's at 250 degrees. And so that is why you can different things. That is why you have to pay really close attention to the recipes, especially for water bath canning, because you, excuse me, you want to make sure that you're making that environment acidic enough so that the bacteria can't live in there. We can go ahead and move into the questions. The first question I got was, can I pressure can on a glass top stove? I always say no. And the reason that is because the pressure canner gets so much hotter than a water bath canner. A water bath canner is fine. You can water bath can all you want on a glass top stove. But a pressure canner, like we talked about earlier, gets up to sometimes even 250 degrees. And oftentimes the metal around it will heat up everything in it. The jars itself, the pressure canner itself will heat up to 250 degrees also. And a lot of gas top stoves are only designed to handle pots and pans that get up to boiling, 212 degrees. And so I don't ever recommend that. It's not necessarily dangerous, but you can crack your, like nothing's gonna blow up or anything, but you can crack your stovetop, which nobody wants, and it's a really expensive repair. So I know that some people do go ahead and say, you know what, it works for me, and they've never had any issues with it, but I personally don't recommend pressure canning on a glass top stove. The next question is, what if my jars don't seal? This is a very common thing, and sometimes it's just the luck of the draw, and you get a jar or two that don't seal properly. That's fine. Personally, if I only have one jar that doesn't seal, I will just pop it in my fridge or use it that night, use it up within a couple of days, because at that point it is akin to an opened jar. So it's not shelf stable, you can't put it on the shelf. I always just put it in the fridge and call it a day, and I would use it up. But if you don't want to use it right away, you can just reprocess it. And I don't like to do this because you're essentially doubling the cooking time of your food, which will make it really mushy and be prone to fall apart. But in order to make it safe and shelf stable, you really do need to completely reprocess it for the exact amount of time, again, a second time. And if it seals the second time, then it is shelf stable after that. Sorry, wanted to get her dressed. The next question is botulism still a thing? Is it something I do still need to worry about? Yes. I don't want to scare anyone. You don't need to be scared of botulism. You just need to be aware of it and respect it. Botulism is definitely still a thing. It can make people really, really sick. It can even be fatal, and so it is something to be taken seriously. But as long as you are following canning recipes accurately, you're not trying to skimp on time or skimp on pressure, you're not altering the acidity of certain recipes like pickles or salsa. You know, there's a reason why a lot of salsa recipes that you water bath can include vinegar in it. It's because on its own they're usually not acidic enough to ward off that bad bacteria. And so things like botulism do need to be looked out for, but there's no need that you should fear them. I think with a lot of canning, people can get scared because of things like botulism, things like exploding pressure canners, things like making your own food shelf stable. You know, those are all real concerns, but at the same time, you know, I have never had any experience with, you know, feeding my family food that I've canned that's made them sick. There have been times where a jar sitting on a shelf that's, you know, several months old will all of a sudden break its seal. And I throw that food out immediately. It is not safe. If the seal does not last and all of a sudden you find that the tab is popped, throw it out. Like, when in doubt, throw it out. We stick to that. And I don't even feed that extra food to my chickens or anything like that, because I have a friend who pressure canned some green beans They didn't seal. She fed them to her chickens and they had botulism in them and it killed her whole flock. And so, you know, if there is any doubt in your mind, if you see bubbles in your jars, that's a sign of bacteria activity. And so you want to throw that out. If the seals pop, you want to throw that out. If it doesn't smell good, you'll throw that out. And so it really is just about using your common sense. If something has sealed right and it's kept its seal and you open it and it looks good and it smells good, chances are it's perfectly safe to eat and you should not be worried at all. And if you question it, if it makes you a little uneasy, it smells a little bit funky and you're not quite so sure, just throw it out and save yourself the peace of mind. It's not that big of a deal. So the next question is about altitude and adjusting the time and pressure for canning at altitude. When you when you cook things in general at altitude, I know I said earlier that water boils at 212 degrees. The higher in altitude you go, the lower the temperature it takes to boil water. So let me say that again. As you increase your altitude, the boiling temperature decreases. And so because that, it's not as hot. So if you're boiling like a pot of pasta, it will take longer to cook at a higher altitude because the water is lower than 212 degrees temperature. And so you won't be able to cook that. It won't cook as fast. And so I hope this is all making sense. But because of that, you have to adjust the time that you cook or the pressure that you cook it at. So this might be a little bit confusing, but if you're water bath canning at a higher altitude, you increase the time. If you're pressure canning at a higher altitude, you increase the pressure and you leave the time alone. And so any canning recipe book that you get will have an altitude chart. Most often, if you get like a packet of pectin, which is a thickening agent for jams and jellies, you will see like an altitude chart. It'll tell you if you are above a certain amount of feet, how much more you need to increase that time to make that product shelf stable. That is something that you definitely want to pay attention to. If you are at sea level, if you're 1,000 feet or below, you don't have to worry about it at all. Just use the standard. You don't have to make any adjustments. I am right at 3,000 feet, and so I only have to increase my time and pressure just a little bit. I usually cook at 11 or 12 pounds of pressure, and I only have to increase my time by like 5% with my water bath canner. But I've already calculated all that stuff out according to my exact altitude and what I'm cooking and everything. And so just make sure that you use what is appropriate for your altitude. It's always good to know what altitude you're at when you're working with stuff like this that could potentially be dangerous if you don't play according to the rules. The next question is if I have any canning books that I recommend. Yes, let me go grab them real quick. For every single beginner out there, I recommend the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. This is my go-to and many canners' go-tos for pretty much everything. This version is up to date with all of the current standards, and so I know that these recipes are going to be safe. It breaks down techniques. It also even talks about like fermentation and things like that. And so I absolutely love this book. This is the book that I buy and gift for other people who are interested in canning. I think that this is kind of just a great standard and baseline for pretty much all canning. The second one is actually this pressure canner's manual. And this one is wonderful. So this pressure canner is actually from 1973. And so it is almost 50 years old, believe it or not. I always double check these recipes in here with a more up-to-date version because I want to make sure that the science hasn't changed since the 70s, which it has. And so there's a little bit of inconsistencies If there is something, you know, if this book tells me to pressure can meat for 60 minutes and my ball book tells me to pressure can meat for 75 minutes, I'm gonna go ahead and follow the more up-to-date one. But this tells me how to individually use this specific canner. And any pressure canner that you buy is going to come with a manual like this. Always hold on to it. I was fortunate enough that when, oh honey. Do you want to hold on to it? I was fortunate enough that back in the day when they made manuals for these, they included so many recipes, and so a lot of the recipes that I use in here I utilize with this pressure canner. And my third book, this is called Beyond Canning, and this one is just kind of a more fun book, and this book really broke down for me the whys and the science behind canning. The pictures are beautiful and the instructions are really clear. It talks about processes and techniques and everything like that. And the recipes in here are different, fun recipes. I found that the ball book has very like standard, common, original recipes, and these are more fun with like a lot of different herbs and seasonings and everything. And so those three books I can't recommend enough. They've been really, really fun. Okay, the next question was specifically about canning salsa, and they asked, do you have to peel and seed the tomatoes before you put them in the canner? Which I don't blame anyone one bit for asking this question, because peeling and seeding your tomatoes is really time consuming. It's probably, when making salsa, it's probably one of the longest preparation steps that you take towards making salsa. Safety wise, no. You can throw your whole tomatoes in, you can add the peels, you can chop them up with the peels and the seeds, and you can put them in and process them with your tomatoes, and they will be just as safe. Now, if you want to if you don't like the texture of the peels and the seeds in it, then yes, you would want to do that. But you know, if you think about fresh salsa oftentimes is not peeled and seeded. And so if you don't mind it in fresh salsa, you probably won't mind it in canned salsa either. Personally, when I'm making diced tomatoes, I leave the peels and the seeds because I don't mind the texture, and when they're chopped up like that, I don't think you really notice a difference. And so I say, if you want to keep the peels and the seeds, you go for it. And that's also why this is also why it's really, let me get you something to play with. This is also why it's really important to understand the science behind it, because, for example, there's a lot of recipes that require you to hot pack the food, and that means that you cook it prior to putting it in the jars, and you heat it up for like 5 minutes, put it in the jars hot, and then can it, versus a raw pack where you can just put stuff into the jars raw and then can it, process it in the canner. So I don't like hot packing because it is an extra step. It takes more time, it complicates things, you have to dirty more dishes, and I always like the laziest, most straightforward way. And so I looked up, why do you hot pack versus raw pack? What is that behind? What is the science behind that? What is the reasoning behind that? And the only reason that I have found that you hot pack something is so that it doesn't change colors to brown, so the food doesn't brown before you can it, so that it looks prettier on the shelf. I don't care if my food looks brown, in all honesty, and most of the time you can toss it, like with fruit especially, you can just toss it with lemon juice and it won't brown and it'll be fine. And so I don't worry about things like hot packing anymore. I raw pack everything because it's going to get cooked and processed in the canner regardless. And so it's always important for things like that and things like peeling. Like fruits, you don't have to peel. You can keep your peaches, your apples, your pears all with the peel on before you can them. It's just personal preference. So if you don't mind the peels and you want to skip that step, just go ahead and skip it. The next question is, what is the minimum number of jars for the canner? One. You can can with just one jar, and that's totally fine. I don't ever can unless I have at least 75% of a canner full, because I don't like to waste the propane and the water to run my stove. And so, but in terms of safety, you can can one jar and it's perfectly safe. Is it dangerous to pressure can inside the house? Yes and no. Not really. A couple weeks ago, we were actually at my parents' house and my grandma brought a pressure canner that she'd never used before. It doesn't have a gauge. It has a weight, and it was a 15-pound pressure canner, and so it only had a 15-pound weight. And when you use a weighted pressure canner, you just have this specific weight. Some of them have like different sections that you can put on it. And when the steam gets to a certain point, the weight's supposed to jiggle. And that's how you know it's at that pressure that you are supposed to obtain. I definitely prefer the gauge because I think it's easier and more straightforward. I don't want to deal with the weight. And this is why. The weight never jiggled for us. I don't know what we did wrong, or if there was something wrong with the canner, because my grandma hadn't used it before. It was new to her, but it was a used canner. And so it never came to pressure. Well, it did come to pressure, we just didn't know it. And the pressure built and built and built and built, and the blow release valve blew off. And steam was spraying everywhere, and it was a big old thing. My parents gutted and completely renovated their kitchen last year. And so steam was like collecting on their freshly painted ceiling. It was bad and dangerous. And so stuff like that can happen for sure. Your pressure canner can blow up. It doesn't hardly ever happen. And as long as you're using the right equipment and you're paying attention to it, it almost never happens. I've never had any issues in my own home with my own canners, not once. And I probably, hopefully, never will, because I'm familiar with them, I'm attentive to them. If this canner is on the stove, I'm in the kitchen keeping an eye on it the entire time. And some of the stuff, like chili, I make chili a lot, it takes, off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure it takes 75 minutes to process. And so I pull a chair into the kitchen, I sit on it with the stove, I usually read a book or work on my laptop and just watch it the whole time to make sure it doesn't get too high or too low. So it's not dangerous to pressure can inside the house as long as you are following the directions properly, which is the same exact rule for, is it dangerous to, can things, period, and make it shelf stable. As long as you're following the directions clearly, then there's no issue at all. And I know several people, especially in the summertime, because your house gets so hot running the canner all day long, they have propane burners outside that they can with. And so if that makes you feel safer, then definitely do that. But if you are pressure canning outside, I think you still need to give just as much attention to those canners outside as you do inside. I don't think outside should be used as an excuse to be able to let it go for longer without watching it or anything like that. Okay, and the last question is, do the foods get cooked in the canner, and how does that texture change? Yes, the foods get cooked in the canner. That is another reason why I don't like to hot pack things. I like to raw pack them. So a lot of times if the food is pre-cooked a little bit, then you can fit more in the jar. But at the end of the day, those foods are going to be a little bit mushier. If you've ever canned potatoes in little chunks, they almost entirely fall apart. Or if you've canned something like beef stew and you've had little chunks of potatoes in there, they will just completely fall apart in the canner because they get cooked and cooked and cooked and cooked at that high temperature for a long period of time. And so with things like that, I like to keep food in bigger pieces. If I'm canning something like beef stew, I will like quarter my potatoes instead of cut them in chunks. And then when I pull that can off the shelf and I heat it up, I will just use a spoon to cut up the potato into littler pieces while it's heating up. Things like peaches, I don't ever get smaller than quarters, because the smaller the food is, the more it's going to kind of cook and break down and get kind of like a softer texture. I wouldn't ever say that it's mushy necessarily. You shouldn't have food that's just like disintegrating and getting mushy in your canner. I think that if you're careful with how you're cooking it and how you're preparing it, then you should never get mushy food. It is soft though. It's going to cook, and you know, you think about like cooking green beans at 240 degrees for 20 minutes. They're going to be soft. Now they're not going to be mushy like I said earlier, but they're going to be soft. I personally don't mind the texture whatsoever. I enjoy the softer foods. I love the meat that comes out of the canner because it's so tender and it falls apart and it's just delicious. And so that's kind of a really nice positive of pressure canning, things like that. But as far as like making crunchy pickles, there are a lot of ways that you can, and I'm not going to get into this video, but there are a lot of techniques and different ways and different ingredients that you can utilize to make sure your pickles aren't mushy when they get cooked in the canner. That they're just, that they're still crunchy, that, you know, they're not going to be raw cucumber crunchy, but that they still have a nice crunch to them and haven't just gotten totally soft in the canner. So that was all of the questions that I had. I hope that this gives clarity to some people, that you guys enjoyed it. I am kind of a nerd in that way, that this information is fascinating to me and helps me with my canning. And so my daughter is moving the tripod. Hazel, easy, oh gosh. So I hope that this was informative. I will go ahead and link those books and some other resources for you in the description. And if you want to go and look at some of my other canning videos, I have one on water bath canning for beginners, where we water bath can apples, and then I have one on pressure canning for beginners, where we pressure can green beans, and those are great foods to start with if you're new to canning. As always, thank you for watching this video. We really appreciate the views. If you would click the subscribe button, that would mean a lot to us. It really supports our family. So thank you guys again so much.